What's up, everybody? It's Soren Baker here on The Soren Baker Show. Thank you guys for listening, tuning in, watching, liking, subscribing, and downloading to our podcast and watching us on Unique Access Entertainment. We appreciate all the support that we get every week. And as you guys can tell, we're bringing a slew of great interviews in. And I'm very excited about our guest tonight because as we talk a lot about music and entertainment and different things that we all love and appreciate and work on, it's also important to show people who love the music, but that also are part of the reason that we get to hear and experience it. And that's one of the reasons why our esteemed guest is here tonight, Mr. Steve McKeever.
Hey.
Thank you for coming through, sir.
Thanks for having me, Soren. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, man. So Steve, for those who don't know, has a very storied history in the music business on the executive side, working at a bunch of the labels, which we're going to get into today, but then also with Hidden Beach Recordings, his label that he founded and brought out Jill Scott. He has the Unwrapped series and the new album that just came out, Unwrapped Volume 8, the Chicago Sessions, and we'll be talking a lot about that because there's a lot of great momentum surrounding that project and also Hidden Beach coming back into the fold. But before we get to all that, Steve, I think it's important to explain that you took a different route, I'd say, than a lot of people did, getting into the music industry and then achieving the tremendous success that you have. And how and why do you think that your path and what it was, why did it work? And explain what the path was.
Well, it's the only path I knew.
Okay.
I mean, so when something's the only way, things generally work out. But I grew up in Chicago,
right?
So I did not, wasn't around like people grew up in L.A. or New York, where there is a real heavy, entertainment business or music business presence.
Right.
So I didn't know. I knew I wanted to be in the music business, but I did not know any route to get. I didn't know anybody who knew a route to get into it.
Right.
And when I talked about it, my parents are big education people, and I think I probably scared them a lot every time I talked about my passion about the music business. I was I thought it was the best business that could exist because it could make me happy.
Right.
If I was feeling sad. I learned about life. Earth, Wind, and Fire, and Maurice White taught me how the universe works, and Stevie Wonder about love, but also politics and apartheid, and Marvin Gaye from Elton John to Aerosmith, the bands of sort of my day, Steely Dan, these great bands were, the fruit of this business that I thought was incredible. So I really, that was my number one thing, to be involved and I was also a musician, so I was just playing a little bit, and but I didn't have a clue. And I think I was about 15, I saw an article in Ebony magazine about an entertainment lawyer based in Atlanta who represented Richard Pryor. He represented Earth, Wind, and Fire, I think, and it was some big comedians and this whole spread. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, okay, that I can do that. Because my dad went to law school at night. So I watched that process from second grade to sixth grade. And it also was going to check off a box and satisfy
make dad
my
happy.
parents. Yes, it make dad and mom happy in that sense, but especially a dad on that side. And once I locked in, this is my plan. I was sort of like a railroad car, on a track headed that way.
Right.
And it's kind of scary to me now when I look at things I wrote back then, like, even applications to school.
Oh, wow.
Where I talk about how my game plan was to, how the industry needed honest reputation, et cetera, but this was going to be my route to make a difference by having a company, have my own company. We're first record companies, and have my own company. And it's been freaky when I've uncovered some of that stuff you write when you're a teenager.
Well, at the time, too, I think it's important, and this speaks to, I would say, your vision, but also what has now become your success, is that at that time, I think it's important to put in perspective, not only being from Chicago, but being a young black man, having visions of not only being a lawyer, but then also to have your own record company was not a standard assumed thing that was normal.
Well, funny, I mean, having my own record company because of Berry Gordy,
right,
and just the unbelievable success, which is to me, he's the most successful record executive, black, white, green, yellow, as far as impact
period.
in the world. I don't think there's a second or third or fourth when it comes to the global impact that he had. So if I told people I was going to have my own, I was going to do a record company or do things like that, I didn't get the same pushback. But the idea of me saying I was going to be an entertainment lawyer, first of all, people didn't even know what that was. Oh, no, I had my heroes. I worked in a recording studio called PS Recordings, which was the mecca for R&B in Chicago. I mentioned Earth, Wind & Fire a number of times, but they cut tracks there. The Jacksons cut tracks there. Peebo Bryson did Feel the Fire in that studio. Ramsey Lewis did. I'm pretty sure Sun Goddess was done there. And so it was a real place where, especially R&B acts, and it was owned by a guy, Paul Serrano. And so there were superstars, Tom 84. There were people who were monsters in the business who just happened to be around. And when I would come up, this little kid, I think I was 15, 16 years old when I had got my little internship there from begging.
We're very similar in that regard.
Yeah,
Let me in
exactly.
the game. Let me in the game.
Yeah, please. I asked if I could sweep the floors and just sort of wouldn't take no. But when, and because my dad had gone to law school at night, he also had a full-time job, so we didn't see him a lot. And when he was in the house, he was always around piles of books. And so for some bonding time for us was like, sit down and read this.
Help your dad
book.
with his homework.
Yeah, exactly. And the big lesson I learned there is that these things, if there was a word I didn't understand, and I was really young, that we'd look it up in this thing called Black's Law Dictionary, this huge book.
Oh, yeah.
And so I learned things like the word perpetuity meant forever.
Very important word in the music business or any entertainment world. Yeah, really any business.
Yeah, and so armed with this little knowledge, and as well as I read at the time, the only book I knew of, and I think really existed, called This Business of Music, which was like the music business Bible. And I read that in high school. Tried to read through. It was not a curl up, by the fireplace type of book, but I had some basic, rudimentary knowledge of the business, and armed with that in the studio situation, cats would give me. Somehow I can't remember how people say, "Oh, he knows how to read." He could read this.
Understand
high
the
school game, and so people would, almost as a test, not because I was in high school. So people would, I think, like almost like giving a monkey something to be able to play with. Can he really, figure out this
Let's
Rubik's
see what he can
Cube?
Really do.
And so they would give me the, document, like a publishing agreement or something, and I would read it. And I would see, that magic word, perpetuity, and I'd see $500 or something. And I would say, well, this looks like what they're doing is getting your publishing rights in perpetuity. Oh, how does that mean? Oh, that means forever.
Right.
Really, and it's for $500, and that's it. That's going to be. And they would immediately, after I would make this, sort of common language interpretation of what I saw, like, oh, that sounds like a terrible deal. And I said, I couldn't really, sort of judge that, but that's what I was reading.
Right.
And so they were a few people were very appreciative of, like, just with that sort of heads up. But then when I said I was going to go on to be a entertainment lawyer is already a stepping stone to what I want to do. There were some of them, I have to say, were very discouraging in the sense that you can't do that and be black. And so I think they were trying to protect me from future disappointment,
right,
that, you cannot have any power in the business on the business side as a African American. And so that was, I didn't really listen to that, but I took note of how much people are like, whoa, that really doesn't. And so that's why that one article I read was so encouraging, that somebody had done it.
Right.
I think his name was David Franklin. And I'd never met him, but that seeing that path.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No.
Well, once you got to law school, then how did you ever waver? Or once you got in and you saw you were exposed to different types of law or maybe different thoughts, it was straight ahead?
I was so on a, like I said, railroad track.
Right.
When I got to undergrad, they must have started off as, I think, political science. I can't remember, liberal arts, basic. But then I discovered, it's been like sophomore year, that there was a program called Independent Plans of Study.
Okay.
And a professor that took me under his wing, so to speak, and was encouraging, sort of pulled me into the IPS, Independent Plans of Study program, and I designed my own major, which was entertainment pre-law.
Okay.
So my degree is in entertainment pre-law in undergrad, which I went to University of Illinois in Champaign, and let me really explore the campus, to take business classes, to the typical sort of pre-law kind of classes, but I also got to take music classes and theater classes, film classes, all about, things that were involved in the arts. And, and that's when I wrote my applications to go to law school. It was all about, this is the business I wanted to go into, this is the impact I wanted to make, and the dearth of people I saw who looked like me, who were out there protecting this, protecting artists.
Mm-hmm.
And so even when I got to law school, funny enough, there was no Entertainment Tonight show, and there was no sort of industry talking about the business of entertainment. So I got teased in when I said, I'm going to be an entertainment attorney, at least my first year, because people thought, you're going to entertain, and be, like going to a courtroom and dance or something. An
entertaining attorney?
Yeah, exactly. I got a lot of jokes about her. You can have your shirt open with gold chains, kind of a thing to be, because at least in the real East Coast elite law kind of world, that was not something that
that's not the Harvard way.
Yeah, it was so anyway, but I was able to combine a lot of my interest I booked concerts, and I had a whole music series in undergrad,
right,
as well as I did radio in undergrad and programmed radio there. And I was able to sort of continue that same path when I got to law school by eventually running the programming for a big speakers program. We became a big speakers program.
So then how did you get into getting hired as counsel for record companies?
First in the summers I worked inside as intern in law firms. I worked for a woman named Linda Minch in Chicago my first summer, who was pretty much the only game in town at the time doing entertainment law. And my extracurricular thing was, she realized I listened, and I loved listening. She had boxes of demo tapes.
Oh, wow.
And so I ended up taking on, and this was not something that was sort of my normal, 9 to 7 kind of job, but I took home her tapes and I listened to them, and I would write these really detailed critiques of why this was good, why this was bad, what they needed to do. It's easy to talk about, but when you're putting in writing, it really have to sort of anything in writing. Obviously, you have to. It helps make your thought process clear. And she loved it because when the group would call, she'd pull out the memo that sort of was attached to it, and Linda's great, and it was an amazing, experience. And my second summer, I worked out here at a medium size, but it was a really prestigious law firm, Irell and Manella in entertainment, with the goal of going to the entertainment department. I eventually came out and joined that firm initially to sort of practice entertainment law, but clearly with an eye always that I was going to be moving,
right.
Moving
in that direction.
Moving, outside of the practice.
Yeah, and then as through our conversations outside of the podcast here, one thing that I always thought was amazing, and that you've told me too, is that how you grew up idolizing and looking at people like Stevie Wonder, and then ended up becoming friends with them through your work with Motown and different labels.
Stevie was way before that.
Yeah.
I mean, and ironically, that was through school, and I'm not sure I told you the story, but I was got into Harvard Law School. I wasn't going,
right,
and drove my father absolutely crazy.
Nuts.
He just nuts. It tortured him, and the last day where I could change my mind and take my acceptance, or take my position, and I'd already was dialed into a school on the West Coast here. It was a great school, but I was really excited about it. He came to my door about 6:30 in the morning, woke me up. I was out late, and said, "Are you really sure this is what you're going to do?" And he leaned against the door jamb and had his hand on his chest, and I'd never seen my father cry before. And it looked like he was going to start to tear up and cry. And I think whatever it was that moment I'd been thinking about, I said, "Oh," and he said, "Okay, I'll go there." And he said, "Are you sure?" And there was some papers from the law school forum and things I'd been looking at, kept nagging my curiosity. And I said, "Yes," and I'll go there and I'll meet Stevie. That's how I'll meet Stevie Wonder, and that's how I'll run this speaker thing, and that's how I'll meet him.
Okay.
And because he was the biggest living hero. I idolized Martin Luther King and Stevie Wonder were like the twin, gods as far as I was concerned. And he didn't care what the reason was. He was like,
go to Harvard.
Go there. And he left, and then about an hour later he called me to make sure. It was 9:00 on the East Coast at that point, and he said, "Did you call?" And I said, "Yeah." I called and was in, and and so when I got to the school, there was a thing called the Harvard Law School Forum, but at the time when I read the materials on it, it talked about how Kennedy spoke there, Castro spoke there, and Martin Luther King spoke there. But when I got there, it was pretty small. The first speaker I think I saw was something like nuclear disarmament, maybe 25 kids or 20 people in the room, in a regular-sized classroom, not even an auditorium. And I kept thinking, like, whoa, I made this, left-hand turn to come here. This is not what I pictured.
Right.
And I thought that the brand, and everybody knew I came there because it was a joke. I came here to meet Stevie Wonder. So eventually we ended up sending out letters in the organization to everybody we ever want to meet in Who's Who. There's used to be a book. I don't know if they even still publish it now, but a book of everybody important. And we sat down, Atwood, everybody who was on in fact, who was running the organization, Jim, sat down and sort of marked who was cool, who would be good.
Okay.
And we ended up sending out the first time ever a word processed letter on this gorgeous, gorgeous letterhead, and got unbelievable responses, because it used to send out like 5. Frank Sinatra,
Wow.
call at my summer job. I mean, it was kind of insane. I had people, the White House calling me. They've, all the guys who had gotten out of prison from Watergate, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman were calling my because we sent invitations. We had heads of state. I think we had the Robert Mugabe. I think the first place he spoke in the United States came over, and it was just amazing. I got to pick up the people generally at the airport. We go to dinner first, and then they'd speak. And so when Stevie office called, a woman, good friend now, Teresa Cropper from his office called, and to say no, that she wasn't, that she recognized as a prestigious invitation.
Okay.
But he was going to decline. And I was so excited that I got the rejection telephone, at least the telephone number, that I ended up calling his office every day, pretty much 5 months, October to like March, 5 days a week. I had some reason to call there, some reason that I would read the news, scan a newspaper every day, just trying to figure out what was the reason. There was a reason today that he should go.
And that's also important to say, because back then you had to pay for long distance. And as a college student, did you pay, or was that part of this
I can't
organization?
remember. No, I think I must have been paying. That's actually good. I've forgotten a lot about that. You're actually right, too, about long distance.
Yeah, it was expensive, too.
Expensive, yeah. But I'm pretty sure I was probably calling those calls from the office, from the law school office. There were no, there was no caller ID back then. But I'm pretty sure I was calling from the actual office.
Okay. So then, what turned the tide?
I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask, the people like Teresa in the office.
Mm-hmm.
They got amused, I'm sure, of just this kid who was calling every day. And I necessarily wouldn't get somebody every day, but I actually got to know people every once in a while. Stevie's brother, Calvin or something, may pick up the phone. And I remember just talking, and I would find out who they were. There are different people around. I got to sort of realize that, like most organizations like that, are fairly small. It's not hundreds of people. And I was actually calling a place where he never hardly was. I was calling his office in Burbank.
Okay.
At the time, the Black Bull offices, where he mostly spent the time at the studio, Wonderland Studios on Western. But the word, I think, got around that this kid was not going away.
Right.
So eventually, I guess it was Teresa and Steve. I don't know I still don't know the internal, but there was like the absolute no started becoming a maybe. And, the one great thing is I had resources at the school. We couldn't pay honorariums, but we could pay the expenses for someone to come there, and which was a big thing for a college, campus to be able to say, here, I'll put you on a flight and you can get here and you're whoever to do. And and a lot of people use the opportunity of the law school forum, Harvard Law School forum, to make a statement. So during a presidential year, a lot of people want to be able to say something there and address this and, press-worthy. And it just so happened that as we were playing with the date, Marvin Gaye got shot.
Ooh,
and so I know Steve had a real fervor to say something about gun violence. And so from what I remember, he went to Detroit, I think, for the funeral. And then he flew to Boston.
Okay.
And in his remarks and in talk, his brilliant speech, actually, he gave to the students about responsibility when you have opportunities like this to give back. But he also talked about the senseless. I mean, it's sad that, it's 30 plus years later and it's still, the same issues are still going on, but he used that. So I think that maybe even that helped fuel the, a real desire, because he didn't just come there and do a speech either. He did a concert, in a auditorium that was amazing.
Wow. Okay. And, then, we have so much history here, but we do have a somewhat of a limited amount of time. So we do have to fast forward through a lot of stuff. But I think it's important to explain to people then, through being counsel for labels and then getting to, run and operate labels, especially working with Mojazz and such. How did you go from the counsel side to being entrusted to running labels or heading labels or launching labels?
My first inside record job was at Polygram Records. And the guy who hired me there was Jeff Sidney, who was sort of head of the West Coast. And he was recruiting me, and we had become friends through the process. And I had discovered a comedian before that named Robin Harris. So I had started a little production company and had him sort of signed to me, my production company. Mr. Tanksley and I, were playing this at one of Robin's really good friends. And when so I always knew that this was a path, and I actually had a goal of having a black comedy label, basically, was my thought at that time. And when I went to meet the president of the Polygram, Dick Asher, and he was on the fence about whether I was going to do this job, a business affairs job, and I was looking for the right to be able to have my hands in some creative things. And I'd already become friends with Ed Eckstein, who had Wing Records, who we got to be friends, not just on the business affairs kind of side, respect, I think, creatively. I respected him immensely creatively. That Dick said, look, you want to be able to work on the creative side of the business. He said, there's no such thing as a job for somebody who helps. So if you come in here and you want to help any department, and that's what your pure motivation is, to help, you could work in any area you want. But you have to do that on your own time. But you have the freedom, meaning that after 7 o'clock or 6:30, whatever traditional hour is over with, if you want to learn promotion, go to the promotion department and say, what do you guys need help in? Do you need help filling envelopes? Do you need help doing this? And if you're just genuine about it, people will teach you a lot more than what you're there to help for.
Okay.
And his life strategy was dead on point. And so Ed, when I came over, Ed eventually signed Robin, had me bring Robin to the label. And since I brought him there and have been working with him, let me produce the record. I had a vision for it, which was Bebe's Kids.
Right.
And so I did my day job, but all that was at night, setting up the performances and working with Robin and Ronnie and throughout this whole process. And it actually got the album. Unfortunately, Robin died while we were recording it. But I think doing that project, as well as other stuff I was doing as a musician and hanging out in the studios, people started to see me. Just my music was cranked. I had my office in the A&R wing of the company, and Goldie and Michael Goldstein, we probably competed for loudest, sort of crank. Bob Scorrell, another friend at that time, in the A&R section, I was cranking all day long, and so I think that people started looking at me not just as this lawyer.
Well, I think too, I think it's also interesting and important for people to understand, like you were just saying, that you did all this other stuff after your quote unquote job was done for the day. because, a lot of people, I think, don't understand or appreciate that once you get in the door with something, then you have to work harder.
Oh, yeah.
And so how and why and when did you learn that it wasn't just getting in the door, it was once you're in the door to put the pedal on 100?
I don't know. I guess I had to do that just because the stuff that I was most interested in was not part of my job.
Okay.
So, even when I was working as a lawyer, I would work, get to the office at 9 o'clock, leave there at 7 or whatever it was. And then I had an hour to sort of, it was almost going into like a phone booth and changing uniform, because I would go home, change my clothes. I was in, sort of nerdy, sport jacket and
Right.
and slacks to, no such thing as, I remember, casual Fridays then. It was even though it was a fairly relaxed West Coast kind of environment, and I would go home, put my jeans and gym shoes on and T-shirt or whatever, and then I would be out either at a club listening to music or in a studio somewhere. And that gig, that was like the 8 to 2 o'clock gig.
Wow.
Because the clubs and everything closed at 2.
Right.
And I was there, and I made so many great relationships and friends just by being big fans of, at my place, there was a club in Santa Monica that had superstar artists to me, but they weren't necessarily getting the pop type of attention.
Right.
They were more jazz and, adult type of music. And I didn't consider that work. All that stuff I was doing I was working hard, I guess, but I was not working. It didn't feel like work at all. There's a lot of aspects of being a lawyer that feels like work, no matter how much you enjoy the process. Redlining an agreement is, I don't think anybody's, fun on a Saturday night, but I could go out with musicians or be in the studio. I was living a dream doing that.
And that, speaking with Robert Harris, obviously, of course, they had the cartoon element to Bebe's Kids.
That happened much later. In fact, a friend of mine, Reggie Hudlin, ended up doing that.
But there was, with his comedy, I think, and obviously you know infinitely better from knowing him and working with him, but he had a unorthodoxness to his comedy, I think, his approach. And from what we saw as fans, did you notice anything differently about how he approached things or how he viewed things that you were able to kind of extrapolate to what you were doing?
No, I mean, I think I had an early belief that the recording process was this ability, this unbelievable magic that you could take somebody's soul and put it in a bottle, basically. You could, done right, you could preserve the essence of what they were doing. And so the experience that everybody had who came to the Comedy Act Theater on like 43rd and Crenshaw at the day was a unbelievable experience that everyone who ever was there at the Comedy Act Theater would never forget. It was just, and Robin held court. He was the king there, even though people in the audience like Eddie Murphy or, major stars of all the NBA, actors, that was Robin's court. And so what I was really trying to do is capture the best of that essence. In fact, it's one of the reasons that album, most comedy albums you listen to, have tracks where they fades in and fades out. And I was using digital technology, able to make thousands of cuts. We actually, since Robin was gone, we edited words to make new words. We was able to create sentences that he didn't say to be able to go segue from one thing to the next. I wanted it, especially since he was gone, to feel like you were at a Robin Harris show. But the one thing I learned from that, which seems so flawless, like what he would go up and do and just seems so natural, he worked his ass off. I mean, he worked and wrote like so many comedians. He was a really hard worker on his craft, and he was sort of constantly tweaking and playing with things, and I got to see and participate in that process.
Okay. And then we're doing a truncated version of a lot of things to make sure we get to everything. But then, of course, you had tremendous and still have a lot of success with Hidden Beach recordings and with the best-selling artist, Jill Scott. The thing that I think people forget or don't remember was the lack of not using her photo or having to promote her without using her image, per se, initially.
Initially we didn't.
So how, when that became the reality, most people would look at that as a disadvantage or a huge hurdle. How did you find you were able to use that to your advantage?
I think, I've always tried to, and, sometimes you forget the basic rules that, you turn everything, whatever cards you're dealt, you try to figure out, okay, how is this an advantage?
Right.
Initially, we didn't have images, and Jill really was insistent about, not being, sort of a image forward, situation. And early on, she got super early on, right around the time I signed her, she got the opportunity to tour with the Roots. Almost simultaneously it happened.
Okay.
And she is a background singer. But we had no pictures of her. There were exceptional demos at the time. But, we just didn't have the tools, but we had this great opportunity to go out around the world, around the country, when she was on the road to sort of promote it. So we said, okay, since she's an enigma, almost this mystery, because she already had written "You Got Me," that and got replaced on it by Erykah Badu.
Right.
So people inside the sort of beltway of the R&B and hip hop game knew a little bit about that story. The story was, in some I don't know, I'm sure how much this was folklore, but someone apparently had said, "Who is Jill Scott?" when it was on that tape.
Right.
But we really kept playing with that since there was no images. Let's take that to our advantage. And we had a meeting on a Saturday and said, we came up with a slogan, sort of, "Who is Jill Scott?" I remember calling Jill in the meeting with her manager, Colin Gale and Tony Rice, and can't remember if Roger was there. And we had a little brainstorm, and Jill said, "I like it, but let's, add the it was I can't remember now if it was, we had Jill, our thing was Jill Scott ?
Okay.
We were going to do as like a picket signs, Jill Scott ? And I think she said, "I like it. Why don't we do, who is Jill Scott?" And I could answer that question from the rest of my career. And say, "Oh, wow, great." Because that was, we initially came up with this, people were going to be walking around picket signs with Jill Scott ? And that was just a placeholder campaign that was going to be there while we figured out what we're going to eventually call the record. By 18 months later, promotion for this, when it came time to put the record out, it just seemed like, we had done T-shirts, "Who was Jill Scott?" Everything else was like, I think she wanted to call it Enigma or something like that. It was like, we had, this it seemed like a no-brainer. Yeah, this is it worked out, and it made us look like we had this game plan all along, which wasn't the case.
Okay. But then soon thereafter, you launched the Unwrapped series.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, as a music connoisseur, especially with rap in particular, to hear the interpretations of the songs with the largely instrumental and the cover versions, with that, I always thought that was so intriguing. So what was the genesis of the idea, and how did this come to light?
Well, I'd always been a fan of the hip hop, especially that we're using some of the jazz samples, and it was Tribe and Ron Carter. I mean, people,
Right.
there were all these. There's a huge influences also, just like Quincy observed. There was so many similarities between the improv, kind of culture, there's hip hop and jazz. And I always thought that a lot of people weren't aware of how much jazz was in hip hop. Right?
Oh yeah, there's a lot.
And so, like, the Far Side had this great song, "Pass Me By," which was a Quincy Jones sample that's so funky, so dope. And the Far Side record was fantastic. But I think I discovered the Quincy sample through the Far Side.
Okay.
And so I wanted to initially put a record out of all the original songs that had been sampled in some of these big records, whether it's Mama, Joe Sample, but Tupac, and things like that. I remember when we went to Warner Brothers, for example, to try to license that as a Joe Sample song or go into some of the other materials, we got laughed at because we hadn't put out the Geo record yet, or we had no releases.
No track record.
And they're like, "You're asking for these big, songs, and how do we know you're going to be here 6 months from now?" And so we got some no's on some real important tracks. Right around that time, Ed Eckstein called me about meeting Tony Joseph, who was playing with the producer who was playing around with some concepts of instrumentalists playing over R&B track. The first track here was an R. Kelly record, and he had Paul Jackson Jr. on it. And it's like, oh, wow, this is a cool concept. And by right around that same time, we realized if we're going to do the originals concept, we're going to have to re-record this stuff because we couldn't get the original material. And so as we didn't have a name for it initially, we liked the concept, and then we sort of, even though the first thing they had done was on an R&B track, we ended up sort of hitting on the idea of doing all hip hop.
Right.
And that's how the first Unwrapped record came about.
Yeah, and then you had in the next several years you released 7 different projects with that, as well as the greatest hits type of records and stuff. And what, as an executive and seeing the feedback that people were getting, what did you notice that you got from it creatively, and that the feedback that you would get? Like, what made it so special to people?
It's funny that the first Unwrapped record was the first time. I think the business wasn't ever really expecting, even the stars of hip hop, it wasn't something you expected someone to cover songs. People just weren't covering hip hop records. Hip hop tracks are so personal. Right. First of all, you're not going to see, somebody going up on a stage and sort of.
Well, yeah, and to your point, it was a big deal. Like, the first real cover that we saw was Lottie Dottie with Snoop Dogg when he redid the Dougie Fresh Slick Rick record.
Right.
And at that time, when he did that, even on the beginning of the song, he's saying, I'm paying homage and everybody else, can eat it because I love this song and I love Slick Rick and I love Dougie Fresh. So not only was it rare, almost never done, Snoop kind of had a little run doing it where he did the Vapors with Biz Markie, and he did Cinderfella, Dana Dane's record, but it was taboo to bite in rap. But then beyond that, the covers, to your point, they're so personal and they're so specific to the artist and the attitude that that's, to me, one of the intriguing things. When I first heard the first volume back in the day, I was just taken aback.
Yeah, it was, it's funny. I was just I was just overseas trying to explain Unwrapped to in a market there that wasn't as familiar, even with the underlying rap songs. And I was trying to explain that when we put the first Unwrapped album out, as big as hip-hop was, it was still fairly underground as far as mainstream. It's funny that we're in a radio station now. Right. The only radio station that was playing full-time hip-hop, I I know in L.A., and I don't know about the rest of the country, but in L.A. was K-Day, which is one of the biggest markets in the world for radio, and it was an AM station. And the only time you saw hip-hop on the radio or heard it was Friday night, mix shows and on the weekends. And so it was in this little, it kept being pushed into this, sort of specialty box. And those artists at the time were, sometimes selling 2 million records for big, but it seemed like no matter who it was, even Eminem's were initially hitting walls about that, and the thought was that's the extent of the business, and it was kids in the suburbs and inner city kids, and that was it. I knew the market was way bigger than that, but I also, once we started playing with the Unwrapped concept, like, wow, this is actually, there's really cool stuff to explore, and it was almost like looping it back. We took, things that may have gone out, like, Who Do You Love, and which, or Jeff Lober samples, songs, and sort of bringing them back almost to their roots across the board. But it just sounded great to me. It was the type of stuff I would like to listen and jam with. So it wasn't so much a big calculation on what the industry is, like you said, but people loved it when we, played it, and it sounded really fresh, and also just conveniently fit some boxes. Let people play the music and actually connect, and that was the biggest thing. That while we had the intention that young people and older people could make discoveries, the younger people could discover instrumental music, and the older people could have some appreciation with jazz, because the division, it's funny talking about division now when the country's so divided, but the division then seemed huge between the hip hop world and the older adult music world and jazz, and our goal was to sort of bring that together. And
it has proven successful, and now you have the Volume 8. And, for people that aren't familiar with Unwrapped, you have songs from around the country. So, some of my favorites, if you look at Electric Relaxation with Tribe Called Quest, you got 21 Questions by 50 Cent, you got Loungin' Who Do You Love by LL Cool J, you got I Get Around by Tupac. So it's different eras, different regions, different sounds, different feels to the music. And then bringing it back for your life full circle to Volume 8 with the Chicago sessions, being it's made in Chicago by Chicago artists. You're from Chicago, and I know there's also some other personal reasons that was important for you. And what made this the right time and so important for you?
Well, we've been talking about it. It was, like I said, it really was, the real impetus for me was the fact, traces back to, August 2017, when I was telling you before, I've got this phone call or text initially about friends who said, I happened to be in Hawaii on a boat, and a friend wrote, are you watching this? And then I wrote back, what are you talking about? And he says, turn on the TV, and I said, there's no TV here. and he, immediately right after the phone rings, I'm in the middle of the water with my family, and you could hear all the craziness, and he says, I think this woman's going to die. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, there's Nazis marching on the street.
Right.
And I was like, what do you, it just seemed like
it's not real.
Not real. And I had turned off the news for a week.
Okay.
And we hadn't read the newspaper. Really, it was a true sort of break from the
grid,
what was going on, and it was the next day when the current president said that there's fine people on both sides, and
all right,
it really was like, oh boy, we got to roll sleeves back. I was so used to artists leading the culture in times like these, and it really was real inspiring because we had a pretty decent hiatus of putting new music out.
Right.
And it was, and so oddly, even though there's no lyrics, so to speak, on the Unwrapped album, the goal of Unwrapped was to bring people together and to have music that people can share of all races, all cultures across the board, and young and old in this real divided space. And that's was like, oh, we really need to do this. And it just so happened that I started talking to a real dear friend, Ivan Dupé in Chicago, who had he had actually done some work on earlier Unwrapped albums. And at the moment, also, every headline coming out of Chicago was horrible.
Right.
The gun violence. I mean, even while we're making the record, like the ludicrous Jussie Smollett story was the headlines and things like that. Like, it was just Chicago just didn't seem like it could catch a break.
Right.
And so it was an opportunity, we thought, to put a really great spotlight on home.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's definitely achieved, and throughout the record, this one is a little bit different in the sense that there's a lot of, all the records I named were classic records when you put out the Unwraps, whereas these are a lot more contemporary in generally speaking. There's a couple that are a few years older, but a lot of them are more current records. So what was the idea to kind of have that shift?
Well, it just shows you how long it took us to make it, too, because some of the things when we made them were current hits. We've always tackled some of the, current hits at that moment. Right. It's just a matter of how long the gestation period,
of
I think,
project?
Of sometimes to come out. But I think like when we did, whether it was Hot in Here, that was probably a worldwide, monster record. There were things that were no-brainers, and we do classic, hip-hop tracks as well. But we hadn't touched this whole genre in 8 years, our genre of sort of unwrapping songs.
Right.
And the sound of hip-hop had dramatically changed as well, from the Atlanta trap and things that were happening to, our brand new artists that had hit the scene that weren't around at all when we did those. So we just did that normal, sort of big picture listening process to see it was all about what tracks would work best.
Right.
There's some things that we work out, and it's like, nothing sort of inspiring came to have us explore, even though it's, maybe a big hit.
Right.
And other things that were necessarily lesser hits, like Gucci Mane's "Miss My Woe." The first time I heard it, I was like, oh my God, that's a blues record, basically. Right. And let's bring that back home as a blues record. Just loving the track. And so it was really just, some of it's just riding in the car to school with my kids, and they're playing some of the stuff that is fresh out and they're listening to, and I'm always saying, oh my God, loving some of the stuff that was happening musically.
Right. And I think too that's a good balance, just having a Gucci Mane, and then you have like The Story of O.J. by Jay-Z, you got Be Careful by Cardi B, you got Pick Up the Phone, Travis Scott. And right there, you're traveling around the different cities, different styles of rap. Obviously we got a woman now in there. And I think that speaks to not only the power of rap, but the power of Unwrapped, in that it's able to bring all different forms, styles, and subgenres of rap together on one project. So cohesively, why do you think why there is a synergy with that on Unwrapped?
I think the one synergy is we used one producer throughout. Okay. We had not always done that. The first few albums had started that way, but there's been other projects where we've used other producers on different tracks, and I think by keeping everything in one house at Level Next Music in Chicago, which is Ivan Dupé's studio, and some super talented players there, right. Musicians like Rich Patterson, Kareem, Taylor Mallory, who were real key, sort of cogs in this process, I think helped the consistency. But so I just think this is one of the best ones we've done, and it's really exciting to me on so many different levels. Not just because of the Chicago hook, the fact that we're just back doing this after so long, and I think because of the general concept is we've stayed fairly close to what we've always done. It's not like we're going out and doing a polka record, that's unwrapping it. So we keep sort of siphoning from the same well.
And then with that too, I think one of the things as somebody that tries to appreciate the sonics of it is the different, there's definitely the bottom of the record, but then the mixing I think is really well done in my opinion.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's thanks to Ivan and to Herb Powers, who actually did mastered our first and a lot of all the Jill Scott records, like he did Who Is Jill Scott, which is sonically just an extraordinary piece of work.
Absolutely.
And but that was an interesting. We went and I think through hearing some of the stuff through the process, it's a balancing test.
Oh yeah.
Because obviously some of the hip hop stuff is made for the big boom boxes type things in the boob tubes in the cars,
right?
And is all bottom basically.
And that's something that Herb Powers, for those that don't know, if you go back and look at your classic Tribe records, among many others, but that's kind of, you look at like the classic Tribe records, he's the one that did them.
Oh, Herb is a monster. And Herb, it was fun working with him again on this process. He and his wife, Angela, have sort of moved back. They had taken a little break down in Florida as everybody's trying to refigure out the music business.
Right.
And they've moved back up to New York, and we're so excited to have had him put his hands on this project. And we went through more than one pass of that balancing test of not wanting to have it sound, sterile clean like it's only lives in the jazz world, but we've always wanted the music to have a head nod to it, and so we've generally kept the music in the same beat per minute, to generally kept in the same key. And I know the DJs have loved that,
right?
Because it makes it eminently mixable into the original. But it's been also pretty funny to hear the comments of the original hip-hop stars throughout 1 through 8 who've heard it and get like, whoa, because, sometimes they're hearing, so sometimes the original hit that they may have made is from a sample.
Right.
And audio quality may be a little bit questionable to begin with. And we're taking these things, everything on these records, there's no samples ever on the records, it's all being played. And so when you're hearing drum sounds, they're sort of drum sounds that are tuned, even if it's programmed, drums, we're tuning it sonically like you would in a, major studio sort of situation. And we've more than once, I could think of a lot of different examples of people like, whoa, that's my track. Like they're hearing it, the actual track, hit in a different way that they didn't hear it, initially. And you'll hear we've also added sometimes some ear candy, sort of sometimes we'll add a change if it's just a groove that's just straight out, and there's not in the your focus when you listen to a hip hop record is the rapper and what he's saying or she's saying. So if you take that away, which is the element, one of the major elements, then we've had to add some interesting ear candy, I guess, to sort of move things in a more song sort of format.
Right. And then you also bring in some vocals there. You had mentioned Taylor earlier with Pick Up the Phone on Volume 8. Is you've done that also throughout the catalog, as you mentioned. But how on Volume 8 for Unwrapped was the creative process of knowing how and when to add vocals to the tracks?
It's always a case by case. I mean, usually we've kept the hooks fairly identifiable.
Right.
It's funny because when we first put out Pick Up the Phone, which is the first time, this is the first record we've done in a streaming era. Then we first put it out, we didn't understand how we had this huge skip rate initially as people were clicking on it and they listened through the hook, like, oh, whoa, this is not who were actually
Travis
looking
Scott.
for the Travis Scott version of it.
Right.
And it's been really funny watching the new analytic, data rich kind of world as people realize, oh, this is that skip rate, has dropped down dramatically as people realize, oh, this is now or even some of the people who may have skipped on it, so we can see the data that they've come back and now listened, a lot more. But I think it is so close. People have thought that, wow, that's not Travis Scott, doing the, recreating his role, or you sampled X, Y, and Z, and that's sort of intentional, is really keeping the original kind of vibe. We've never tried to do sound-alikes. There's karaoke companies that try to do that stuff all day long. So we've never tried to just imitate. We're always trying to keep the spirit that makes the original record have a real head nod to it.
Yeah, and then Volume 8 is brand new. Unwrapped Volume 8, the Chicago Sessions, is brand new. It just came out. And then I know you've said you've got other ones. You're not going to take a big break anymore.
No,
you're back.
We're already, there are projects that we had started on before we went into hiatus that I want to go back and revisit. Okay. We've got some superstar producers who are actually working on a project, at a big, accident in my family, a car accident that sort of marked a point of, momentum moving forward inside the company. And there were things that we were in the process of working on that were sort of casualties of that sort of stopped. That I say, oh, wow, there's great stuff that we've actually have in the can that I want to go back to, as well as there's just new music being made every day. I mean, Pick Up the Phone is from 2 albums ago on Travis Scott. He's, his last album, to me, it was really, again, sonically and musically one of the, really most intriguing things. And there's a number of tracks on there. And I was like, oh, wow. But we're finishing up, sort of Pick Up the Phone.
Okay. Well, there it is, y'all. Well, Steve, thank you very much for coming through here to the Soren Baker Show and talking about Unwrapped and your storied history in the game. I appreciate it. And everybody make sure Unwrapped Volume 8 is on all streaming platforms. Buy it, stream it, download it, etc. And make sure to follow Hidden Beach and Unwrapped on social media as well. And Steve, anything else you wanted to add?
No, I'm a Soren Baker fan, so
well, thank you, sir.
Everybody should buy Soren's book as well, the
please
history of gangster rap.
Yes.
And which I'm just started reading myself, and it's stories. I don't care how much you know about the game or what was going on at that time. You're going to learn a lot. So it's really interesting reading it, just like, in the recent movie, just being able to, and having the success where you're saying, wow, I was there, I saw this, I remember this. But there's Soren is a not only a musicologist and a music fan, but a real historian. And I think that he's taken his book with a real, not an academic type of thing, but a real, serious, and has given it the weight in the culture that I think it deserves. Is a really important. It's amazing to me that book hadn't been done before you wrote it. So congratulations to you on something.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really, really good book.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And there it is, y'all. Thank you for listening, watching the Soren Baker Show here on the Digital Soapbox Network, as well as Unique Access. Thank you again to Steve McKeever for coming through. Make sure you pick up the Unwrapped Volume 8, the Chicago Sessions, and we'll catch you guys next week on the Soren Baker Show.